Let's start working on submitting the recipe. Let's give the recipe form an ID of recipe-form. Above this form, let's add a status div with the ID of recipe-status. We'll use this div to display a message to the user whether or not the recipe was submitted successfully. Open the main.js file. This is the same file that should contain the rating submission. Let's listen for the form submission using the on method. We'll be given an event object. We're going to call the preventDefault method so that the form isn't submitted. We want to use Ajax for submitting the form. We're going to hide the form during submission. This will make sure the user doesn't submit the form twice. Next, we're going to select the status div and add some HTML. Add a simple waiting message. I'm going to wrap this around some bootstrap markup to make it look good. Just like last time, create an object that will contain the form values. To grab the values, you simply select the input fields by their IDs and use the val method to get the value. For the action, we'll set this to rSubmitUserRecipe. Grabbing the content from the editor is pretty simple. When we included the editor, WordPress also loaded the TinyMCE object. We can grab the content by using this object and grabbing the current active editor and call the getContent method, which will return unsanitized HTML. Lastly, we submit this data using jQuery's post method. Remember that the recipe object is available to us and we can reuse it to provide the Ajax URL. Inside the response function, we'll be doing either one of two things. We're going to check the data object for a status property and check if its value is equal to 2. If it is, then we know that the form submission was a success. Otherwise, an error occurred. I'm going to update the status HTML appropriately. If the submission was a failure, I'm going to show the form again. Let's handle the form submission now. Inside the main plugin file, let's add the action hook WP Ajax. We have to append our action to this hook like so. The function we want to call will be the same name as the action. I'm also going to make this hook available for guests, as I'm going to allow for guest submissions too. Inside the process folder, create the file called submit-user-recipe.php and define the function here. We'll need to include this file from the main plugin as well. Create a variable named output. This will be an array that will contain the status. Set the status to 1. I'm going to perform a very simple check on the title input. I want to know if it's empty. If it is, I'm going to send back the output with the WP send JSON function. This will also kill the script. After this, I'm going to paste in some code. Pause the video if you need to. All I'm doing here is sanitizing the input. I'm also creating the metadata. We create the recipe data array just like last time. I've set the rating and rating count to 0. Something you'll notice is that for the title, I'm using the sanitize text field function, but I'm not applying this to the content itself. We can't use this function for sanitizing the content. Instead, I'm using a function called wpkses_post. In the resource section, I provide a link to a function called wpkses. Let's take a look at this function in more detail. There are a few libraries out there in PHP that help with sanitizing HTML. WordPress provides its own solution, which is the preferred method for sanitizing HTML. The wpkses function is a pretty flexible function, as it allows us to define what HTML tags, attributes, and protocols are allowed. It would be pretty time-consuming to have to re-enter what HTML is allowed every time we use this function. If we scroll down, there's a link to the WPKSES post function. This function does the exact same thing as the WPKSES function, but instead uses the same filter for posts. This saves us some time. Since our recipe post is basically just a post, it makes sense to just use this shorter function. If you prefer to define your own set of HTML and attributes, then I suggest using the WPKSES function. All our data is now sanitized and ready to be inserted into the database. Inserting a post is actually really easy. We don't even have to use the global WPDB object to perform this task. WordPress provides a handy function called WP-InsertPost. I'll provide a link to this function inside the resources section. This function will insert a post for us and even take care of sanitization just in case we forgot to do it ourselves. There's only one parameter, which is an array of arguments. There are numerous things we can set, but we won't be using all of them. The only required arguments are the content and the title. If we skip anything, WordPress will fill in the rest by default. This function will end up returning the ID of the post created, which we will need for adding the post metadata. Creating a variable named post ID and its value will be the value returned by the WP-InsertPost function. Pass in an array. We're going to define the following arguments. Post content will be set to the content variable. Post name and post title will both be set to the title. The difference between these two is the name will be used for the slug and the title is used for the human readable title. Post status will be set to pending. By default, this is set to draft. We'll consider the post complete, but we don't want to publish the recipe either. Pending will let administrators know that the post needs to be reviewed before being published. Post type will be set to recipe since that is our post type. That's it. Feel free to read over the codex and set the rest of the arguments if you would like to customize this further. Next, let's call the update post meta function to set the recipe data metadata. Our function is almost finished. All we need to do now is update the status in the output array to 2 and then output it using the WP-SendJSON function. Refresh the recipe form page and try submitting the form with no input. You should get an error. Now try filling in all the fields and we should see a success message. You should also have your console open to check for any errors. If you've received no errors and received a success message, then there's one last thing we need to check. Go to the recipe admin page and see if the post has been added. After confirming that it's available, let's view the contents in the editor. As you can see, everything was inputted correctly. This is exactly what we wanted. We now have a form where users can submit their own recipes. What I like about this is that even though we're not using the Gutenberg editor on the front end, this will still work. The content has been converted into a block called the Classic block. This makes Gutenberg backwards compatible.